I'm Alfonso Winker.
And I'm Trina Olson. And together, we're the co-founders of Team Dynamics.
And this is Behave. Hi, and welcome back. Trina and I thought we would do something a little bit different today. We thought that since we've been inviting all of you on Behave, since we started staying at home, since in the US and in Minnesota, we've really been thinking about American workplaces and how we are making these shifts and pivots to online, that we would actually offer something more like a workshop. So normally Trina and I have a little bit of a conversation, but today we're going to offer you just some of our content. So let's get into it. Are you ready, Trina?
Yes, I am. Thanks for asking. So we're in a really unique global moment, and all of the truths about systemic injustice and inequity are still true. In fact, the thing that many managers, workers, workforces, workplaces are noticing is that, wow, your org culture always matters. Your identity and your sets of identities are always present. And if those two things are true, and you want to do well by work, at work, driving closer to your vision and mission, what are you going to do about these two truths being true? So, as a reminder for listeners, when we on Behave and at Team Dynamics say culture, we mean something really specific. If you are catching people using the word culture to avoid saying things like race, gender, xenophobia, like I don't know what you're talking about when most folks just say, we've had a real shift in our organizational culture, or working from home has made our culture different. I'm always going to say, different in what ways? What elements of your culture? So here's what we mean. There are three really important elements when we're using the word culture. The first is that there are shared patterns. You may think of these as habits. You may think of these as just the way we do things around here. But it's essentially what we can count on. And some of these things are informal, some of them are formal. Some of the patterns have been established by rules or regulations, and some just became how you start to do work together, whether that's online, whether that's on calls, whether it's in meetings. So there are patterns to how you do things at work. The second element of culture is that a whole lot of these patterns don't mean much of anything until we assign them meaning. And this is often where we can sort of run into each other when I might behave in a certain way over Slack to my colleagues, and what I'm trying to communicate comes across differently to different people. And what is or isn't appropriate is the third piece. So we are deciding moment to moment, day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, what the boundaries are at work. And part of what we're learning during this global pandemic is that a whole lot of the old boundaries had to get thrown out the window. And the reason why is it used to be for a lot of people, not everybody, but for a lot of people, that working from home was the aberration. That was out of pattern. That was not the norm. Even in a week, so maybe you worked from home 1 day a week. So the pattern is 4 days a week you worked in an office, 1 day a week you work from home or remotely. We are trying to figure out what are the new boundaries, where are the edges and why. And it can be appropriate and inappropriate when it comes to how we talk to each other and how we interact. What is or isn't appropriate is also often beneath the surface and really being actively negotiated. So we might not know what's inappropriate until we run into a boundary we didn't know was there. So as we think about our workplace culture, constructive workplace cultures, toxic workplace cultures, we're trying to think about, okay, what are the patterns? How did they happen? Are they in service to our goals or not? What do they mean? And what do they mean differently to different people? How are we loading meaning onto behavior? Who gets to decide the ultimate meaning? And where are the edges? What are our creative constraints so we can have room to play inside of that and do our best work? You will be unsurprised to know that metaphors, stories, and visuals really help us as adults learn and retain information. So many of you might have become familiar with the framework of an iceberg when we think about culture. There's a couple reasons why. If you imagine an iceberg, The thing about icebergs that's important when we think about culture is that a little bit of the iceberg is peeking up above the surface. The vast majority of the iceberg we cannot experience unless we are underwater with it. And so when we think about this iceberg as an example of cultural practices, patterns, meaning making, and boundaries, some of the things are above the waterline, meaning we have a plan about them. We talk about it in meetings. Maybe there's some stuff written on our walls about who we are, how we are, the way we do things, and what we've decided it means. So there might be some indicators that you experience through one or more of your senses that tells you what the rules are in this space and how we're going to be together. The vast majority of ways we as adults behave with one another, collaborate, communicate, work on projects, strive towards shared goals, are things that we really will likely not be on the same page about because we weren't raised by the same people, in the same houses, at the same time, in the same parts of the planet. Right? So let's assume we're all coming from different family structures or places of origin and then coming to try to do some work together. So we have to talk about things like notions of logic or validity, our concept of cleanliness, our pattern of communication, because I might think I'm a really effective communicator because I like to tell stories out loud to Alfonso. And Alfonso might think I'm not a good communicator because although I'm a great storyteller, I often have grammatical mistakes in the emails, right? So who gets to decide what patterns of communication are, what they mean, what's inbounds and out of bounds? So the challenge and what we're asking people to really take this time to consider is how we experience patterns at work, how we might be experiencing them differently now that we are inside of this sort of global medical crisis and economic crisis. And when we jump to meaning making and even farther than that, policing. And by that, we mean you might be behaving in a way that is absolutely in bounds for you, but out of bounds for me. I've maybe never told you that I don't like it. And so I'm trying to make you stop. Or I'm trying to make you start, or I would prefer if you would do things more like how I did them. So we have to catch ourselves about how we interact with one another's patterns. A reminder that there is more below the waterline, and although some of these conversations may feel new, unpracticed, or uncomfortable, we deeply promise it's worth it. If you are not actively navigating and negotiating, you are making more and more space for people to become disgruntled, upset, frustrated, miscommunicate, be in conflict. So this idea that we should say, okay, how are we making different decisions differently? Is it always rank order based on positional power? Do we always take a vote? Does the person with the most expertise decide after we weigh in? What do we think we know? What have we decided and what have we made clear to other people? And finally, different communities build and retain their patterns for different reasons. So if Alfonso sends something to me through the course of work that he believes is a finished product, it's because he believes it's finished. If I think it's not, that's for a particular set of reasons. So assuming that we all are on the same page about what the outcome should be or the output or the impact might not be a great assumption to walk around with. So remembering that different people, different sets of people, people with shared identities, people with different identities are coming to work having lived their whole lives and having lived their whole day up until the moment they log on, call in, check in. And so how are we navigating our patterns? And are these patterns in service to our work, getting us farther away from our goals, or are neutral and could be better? The thing we want to do is zoom in right now on cultural patterns at work. And so Alfonso and I have sort of lovingly been calling life before the pandemic the before times. And now there's the now times. And then there's the future times, right? We're in the midst of some intense time travel, most of us, trying to figure out how what we were doing before is relevant, what of it isn't, and knowing little bits about what we think could be coming. How do we plan, lead our organizations, and drive a strategy? So one thing to take time to do, and we strongly encourage not just doing this in your head, it is really helpful to have a device that you write in or a pen and a piece of paper to actually start writing out little, medium, and big patterns. that you yourself engage in. So an example for me might be before the pandemic, if I knew somebody was ill on our team, I would ask about their health. Now I ask all the time, or I reference health a lot, including health of family members. Next, how am I considering how people are healthy, well, present, not present, really busy, really bored, right? What are all those things coming up? So we consider in the before times, so before the stay-at-home order and before COVID was part of our day-to-day reality, what patterns were serving you? Now, knowing that whenever you're listening to this, now is now. So now, what patterns have emerged? What have you started doing or doing differently? So an example for me would be I have started thinking really intentionally about the modes I use for different conversations. So I'm a little more conscious about, should this be a Zoom call? Should we have video? Should this be a walk and talk that's on the phone? Does this even need to be a meeting? Is this an email? Are we, so just really, I used to be in a pattern of I had really set meetings. And since that pattern got taken away, I've been repatterning and trying to figure out what do we actually need. And just because the meeting was an hour, could it be 45 minutes? So that's a now pattern that's emerging. Next, what patterns do you anticipate you will need to develop next? We have said a couple of times, and our listeners have been hearing this, we anticipate there is no such thing as a go back to the old way. And there's no such thing on the horizon until there is a vaccine readily available to everybody, as just opening the doors and everybody goes back. So there's going to be a hybridity in our future. So what are we imagining are some patterns we might need about what it's like to lead meetings or conversations or brainstorm sessions when maybe 2 or 3 people are in a room and 5 or 6 people are on Zoom? How are we going to start leading those meetings? What patterns we'll need to develop? Digging even deeper as we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and as we've troubled the waters around the fact that, yes, we are all having an experience of living through or attempting to live through a pandemic, we are not experiencing that experience the same. So you did the work of taking some time, and you can always pause this and come back to it, to write down what were the patterns that were working for me, but who else were they working for? So not assuming generalizability or assuming one size fits all. Were there some patterns that were and were not working well for staff prior to the stay-at-home orders being put in place? What assumptions are you making? And the way I check in about this for myself, if I'm really being honest, is what am I 100% certain of? What do I think I know? Because I have some information and some relationships and some experience, so I'm extrapolating. What do I have no idea? And if I'm honest, I'm guessing. So that's kind of how I dig a little bit deeper into, am I making assumptions that because 2 people in my IT department told me X, Y, or Z, that then it just is true for everybody in the IT department, right? So thinking about some of those assumptions we might be making. Do you have a shared meaning about the meaning of your different patterns and what is appropriate or not appropriate? So we know that time and clothing are hot button issues right now because we are just living in a new reality where I am wearing a business top and pajama bottoms. So it's like the stay-at-home mullet, right? Like business up front, party in the back. It's like, okay, I have slippers on and I absolutely got ready for my workday. I'm prepared. And because I was going to be in front of people in a professional setting, I chose to change out of my t-shirt and put a different shirt on. So do we have a shared meaning about what it is people are wearing? And if we decide that means they're sloppy or unprepared or overwhelmed or frazzled, or if it means they're comfortable, open, flexible, right? Like fun, I don't know. So it can be the exact same thing. Like our patterns of outfits have changed, but what does it mean to us? And am I projecting my meaning onto other people? And how do you know? How can you check? How can you build relationships, across lines of difference, across your colleagues, where you can say, here's what I'm noticing about my pattern of logging in around 9:05, 9:10, because I'm trying to show colleagues that I am up and working, but I don't have a meeting with anybody until 11. So like, I'm trying to get in people's inboxes or digitally in front of them so they know I'm at my desk, whatever that means, right? What does it mean for you? So how are we checking any of those assumptions? And how do we know that the patterns are working for our work?
So thanks for talking to us about culture, Trina. Really quickly, oftentimes folks wonder, are these questions just for me? Should I ask other people these questions? So one of the things you'll want to do is first, all of those questions Trina was posing is spend some time with yourself, whether it's a journal, on paper, you're typing on a device somewhere, and then make the offer to your team to have that question. So always self-awareness first before you go asking people other questions.
And Alfonso, before we move off of culture, or add to culture rather, would you share with our Behave listeners some of the before patterns for you, some of the now patterns that are emerging, and some of the things on your mind for next so they could get some additional examples?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm thinking a lot about how I organize my days. So, as owners of a company, as folks that spend a lot of our time either creating content or out training and speaking with people, the before times were really full with sort of the logistics of getting from place to place. So, usually I had to be somewhere by about 8 or 9 in the morning. And so that meant I needed at least, we live in an urban area where there's rush hour. I drive. So I usually needed at least 30, if not 45 minutes to get somewhere, figure out what the weather, construction, traffic were doing, and get somewhere and sort of be ready, which also meant I was either like skipping breakfast or eating really fast and not getting to do a lot of my sort of focus for the day. And so my now pattern is my earliest meetings are after 9. Once in a while, I'll have an earlier meeting if someone really needs to talk. But what I'm able to do right now, and I recognize the privilege in it, but it's also really, I think, serving me and serving our content and our clients well, is I am able to fully make a breakfast, do some sort of journaling or meditation, get some sort of exercise in so that I am ready and able to actually put my full attention into what is in front of me. And so I'm not frazzled from traffic or, upset because it was warm and I got sweaty on my way into the meeting, or it was raining and I forgot my umbrella to cross the street from the parking ramp to the building I was going in. So there's a lot that's happening right now that is allowing me to have a full, long morning so that I can be super present to whatever I'm doing at the time. And when I'm thinking about next, I'm anticipating that my life will require some sort of hybrid. So for anybody that works with us, you can anticipate that I'm going to have some more or increased boundaries about my availability, especially when it comes to how early in the morning I can be somewhere and for how many hours in a row I can do things. And then I'm also going to have to figure out what it means to ease back into moving from place to place. So part of what has been lovely is being at home has meant I can really breathe between things and not have to worry about the logistics of getting to the next thing.
Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to name, as these patterns are developing, the things we know even on our team is that some people are having the opposite experience. Like they used to be able to drop kids off and then be able to set for their day. And now it's like there's people in their house all the time. And so this joy and challenge of, you've even said on other podcasts, you really miss having that commute in a reset time. But it sounds like you're developing new ways to do that. And you're imagining what is it like holding both of those opportunities moving forward, but not just cranking back into the old way because that was the old way. Thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's layer in identity. So Trina started by saying identity is always present, culture always matters. So what are we going to do about that? Now that you've spent some time considering all of those patterns, their meaning, what is appropriate and inappropriate, and really checking the assumptions, there's a layer that's really important. And identity is a really important layer to our experience. We are always experiencing our experience through the lens of identity, whether or not we're talking about it. So I am always a 33-year-old Mexican American man, meaning I'm always my race, I'm always my gender, I'm always my sexuality, I'm always all the things that I am, whether or not I'm remembering that my thoughts, feelings, opinions, reactions are informed by that, and whether or not you're asking about it or paying attention to it. And in this moment, our experiences of identity are exacerbated, meaning under stress, we tend to focus on what we would talk about as our marginalized or target identities, meaning I'm more vigilant of and aware of. And then also the media, the government, and all of the scientists are telling us that along these predictable lines of differences that make a difference, folks are hurting more. So we invite you over to our embodied identity house. If you've been in a training with us, you've been able to interact with the house before. And the house really drives home the point that identity always matters. We are always our whole house. We're grateful to our friend and colleague, Corey Nakamura Lin, who helped us come up with the visual for the house or the graphic for the house. And a quick aside, the house really stems from a conversation Trina and I had in Atlanta in, I think, 2016 with our friend Marcus, who's now the CEO of Grantmakers for Effective Organizations. And Marcus said, I don't need to live in a race house, but if we're going to have conversations about justice, I need to come in. We all need to come in through a race door. And so we've really run with that metaphor over the last several years. The reality of identity is that through our lenses of identity, we're experiencing praise, we're experiencing pride, we're also experiencing pain, meaning there are aspects of myself that I get a lot of praise from other people for. There are aspects of myself that I have a lot of pride in, but there are also aspects of myself that experience systemic and structural discrimination and marginalization. So then I end up having pain. And that feels really true for me. When it comes to some of my identities, like my identity as a gay man, I really have a lot of pride in being part of the LGBTQ community and really see it as an asset and feel as though I've learned a lot of important lessons from the movement and from that community. And at the same time, every day in the United States and its colonies, LGBTQ people are under attack. Also, what's important to remember is that in different contexts, we are more or less aware of certain parts of our identity. So different contexts, meaning right now in this pandemic moment, you may have had a ton of conversations with someone about their religion or their age in the context of your workplace. And right now, let's say they're a caregiver and there's all kinds of messaging coming out right now about how whether or not women are being productive or who's doing the emotional labor with young people at home or anyone that we give care to at home. Folks might be now thinking a lot about their gender and their gender roles. And so the house gives us an opportunity to have really specific conversations. So if you don't have access to looking at the house, I'll talk to you about it. It is a 3-story house that also has an attic and a basement. And there are a number of rooms, about 9 or 10 rooms. And each room is labeled with different aspects of identity. Folks might wonder, how did we pick these? These are most of what are considered the protected classes in the state of Minnesota. From state to state, protected identity classes vary. We are based in Minnesota, so we use these. So we have a bunch of rooms. Up in the attic, we have the immigration room and the bathroom class, socioeconomic class. In the bedroom, language. In the hallway, age. In the laundry room, ability. In the kitchen, religion or faith. In the living room, sexuality or sexual orientation. In the front entryway, gender. Downstairs, we have ethnicity. And our door is our race door. So there's a couple of things to know about our house. We have updated it. There's a chairlift in the hallway to go up and down the stairs. There's a ramp in the front to access the front door. However, we're not up to fire code at the Team Dynamics house. There's only one way to come in and out of our house, and it comes from that conversation all those years ago in Atlanta. It's our race door, and we highlight that door, and the light is always on. So if you're accessing the graphic, the door is tinted yellow because the light is always on there, because we know in the United States and its colonies, race is a construct that's made up and real in its consequences, and it's a difference that's making a difference across all other aspects of identity. So we are never not talking about race because our experiences in our context are racialized. So I would suggest that folks give the house some time, consider all the different words and phrases you use to describe the different rooms of your house. I want to call your attention to a couple of the aspects of our house. First, let's head back up to the attic. Let's think about immigration. So right now, our context is a global pandemic. The United States government and many states are issuing different relief efforts, the CARES Act, the PPP program, different unemployment benefits are rolling out. And the reality is that for undocumented immigrants, folks who are major drivers in the US economy, they don't have access to the various stimulus funds and packages that are rolling out from governments. And so while some of us are hustling to figure out how to access some of those government programs, for undocumented folks who were already pushed to the margins of our society, despite the fact that they're major contributors artistically, economically, culturally to our communities, organizations that are working with undocumented folks are having to do double down their work and figure out workarounds to access funds to make sure that communities that were already at risk in being targeted can have access to making sure they have stable housing, food, etc. Let's zoom in on race, knowing that we're never not having a conversation about race. Right now, in the midst of stay-at-home orders, Black Americans who are unarmed continue to be killed by white Americans. So in a time when we can't gather, we can't get together with our communities of support, we can't march, we can't protest, we can't organize in person in the same way, but I know some folks are doing some kick-ass organizing online. Black, Indigenous, and people of color folks in America right now are having to watch online and on TV the continued violence and anti-Blackness that has been prevalent in this country since the very notions of the American experience. And so we're also being asked to come to work in the midst of this happening. Additionally, if you are awake and paying attention, the data is bearing out what we already know is that a pandemic is going to hit communities of color harder because more folks of color are already at risk and living on the margins. And so when we look at the data about Black and Brown communities across the nation, there's an increased percentage of both cases and deaths from COVID-19. And so while folks are at home attempting to create or build or achieve their workplace goals, all of this is happening. So the invitation as leaders of teams is to make sure that we are creating the space to normalize a practice of talking about how is our lens of identity impacting our experience in the workplace. We'll offer you 4 questions. So again, get out a pen or a device to reflect on 4 questions. So we begin with, for you, what rooms in the house are making a difference for you in the last week? Not the whole last 2 months of stay at home, but in the last week. What rooms are making a difference for you? And in what ways? The second question, how has that changed your decisions or behaviors? So you're really thinking about your race, your gender, your religion, your relationship to immigration. In what ways are you thinking about it? And then second question, how has that thinking changed your decisions or your behavior? What rooms is your team talking about and in what ways? And what is or isn't being shared? Your answer to that third question, what rooms is your team talking about, could actually be they're not, or no one has asked, or folks are sort of suggesting, they're saying things like, with everything going on for different kinds of people, but they're not actually naming the differences that are making a difference. And the fourth question is, do you need to check in? What are you curious about? What are you ready, willing, and able to do, shift, or change? And that fourth question about do you need to check in with your team and have a conversation about what aspects of identity are folks feeling any sort of praise, pride, or pain in this moment around? As a manager who might be leading this conversation, it's important to ask yourself, what am I ready, willing, and able to do, shift, or change? So don't make any offers or promises that you can't keep. So don't say, I really want to have this conversation about identity. What aspects of your identity are impacting you? I want to make sure that we can be flexible and tend to all of the complexity of who you are and how you are. And then you listen and you take notes and you receive the information from your team, and all of a sudden you realize, oh no, me and my workplace aren't ready, willing, and able to do that. So make an inventory for yourself as a team leader to consider what you're actually capable of shifting and changing. So the moral of the story here is coming back to our initial point of the combination of culture and identity. We're always in our bodies. We're always experiencing our experience through the lens of our identities. And depending on what's happening in that day, that month, in the media, with the pandemic, the perspective, the element of our identity that feels particularly salient to us may be shifting and changing. So we have to remain curious with each other about how those things are showing up. We learn our behaviors from people, either implicitly or explicitly. And so we have to investigate our behavioral patterns as a team to see what's serving us and what's getting in the ways of our goals. So many of our days are about repeating patterns. So we have to make good choices, paying close attention to what have we decided this pattern means? What aspects of our identities are hot right now? So our question for you is, how will you discuss culture and acknowledge the impacts of identity with your team? We always want you to get in touch with us. So you can check out our website, teamdynamicsmn.com. Send us a tweet at Behave Podcast, or send us a question, team@teamdynamicsmn.com. Thank you so much for hanging out with us. Take good care, wash your hands, stay home if you can still, and make good choices.